Two old foes talking about war, Israel and Iran.
Israel and Iran are staring each other down tonight across the expanse of Syria.
The strike by Israel against Iran's nuclear program.
Israeli airstrikes hit dozens of Iranian targets in northern Syria.
In this video, we will be tackling one of the conflicts that is currently happening, which is the conflict between Iran and Israel. We will discuss its background, issues, causes, our analysis, and the IR theory that we think is applicable to this situation. Before we proceed, we will first discuss their background so that we can know what led to the issue.
Over the past 74 years, the relationship between Israel and Iran has been one of the most complex and dynamic in the region. Transformed from close multi-layered cooperation into outright advocacy of Jewish state's destruction. From collaboration to implacable enmity, from friendship to current hostility. In the past, Israel and Iran maintained close ties. Relations between the two countries were frequently founded on shared geopolitical interests, resulting in years of cooperation both before and after Iran's 1979 revolution. Here are the lists why they collaborated in the past. First, the Iranian regime and Israel saw Saddam Hussein's Iraq as the most significant threat to their national security interests. Second, fears of Nasserite pan-Arabism and Soviet influence in the Middle East united the two countries. Last, Israel saw Iran as the important part of its periphery doctrine, which was intended to balance out Arab states through military, intelligence, and economic cooperation with non-Arab states like Iran.
Then, the hostility between both parties began because of several reasons, such as the defeat of Taliban in Afghanistan, which represented a major threat to Iran, also led to a feeling of increasing Iranian power, and thus Iran jumped to the top of the list of Israel's most threatening enemies. Second reason, with the fall of Soviet Union and the defeat of Saddam Hussein regime in 1991 Gulf War, the main threat to Iran became the United States, or the Great Satan, whose regional handmaiden was the Little Satan, or Israel. The third reason, Israel and Iran are not military equals, and their power disparities may lead to a more volatile relationship. And the last reason, Iran political ideology and rhetorical legitimacy, and that in Israel, the introduction of the nuclear dimension into the conflict may prove especially destabilizing.
The reason why the conflict still exists and is getting worse is because of their issue. These issues are, first, the Iran-Israel's proxy conflict is ongoing proxy war between Iran and Israel. The conflict involves threats and hostility by Iran's leaders against Israel, and their declared objectives to dissolve the Jewish state. The second, Israel is also concerned by Iran's nuclear weapons program and missile program, and is seeking to downgrade Iran's allies and proxies as well as preventing Iranians' entrenchment in Syria, another sworn enemy of Israel. The third, Israel turns opposed Iran's nuclear program and maintains ties with other rivals of Iran, such as Saudi Arabia and the United States. The last, the United States begins providing Israel with military assistance after its withdrawal from Arab countries as a part of peace process. The U.S. has acted vocally to support Israel's military superiority in the region and to prevent host acts against it by Arab nations.
The first cause for this conflict is Iran nuclear program. Iran started the nuclear program during 20th century. As the state leaders wants the country to lead the Middle East as the state who has the most advanced power. This was made achievable through the lenses of nuclear development as a symbol of Iran's accessions to the region's supreme dominance. Consequently, despite the consistent bilateral talks and negotiation done internationally with the participation of central and weird international organizations, which caused Iran to face sanctions and restrictions, they continue arming and training Shiite militants through the Quds Force, as well as the development of ballistic missiles. Though Iran continues to insist that the nuclear weapons and missile programs is only for the sole purpose of peace and national security protections. Intimidation still occurs as a sense of energy investment is far more efficient for the state and its government. The threats are inevitable as the proxy warfare of Iran with its region is still falling out, specifically against Israel, who support the United States with its descent to the former nuclear or missile programs. Next cause for this conflict is Iran ideological hatred. The Islamic Republic of Iran religious leadership thinks that the Jewish state has no right to exist and Israel will either under military pressure or be exterminated when it is weak and defenseless. Iran ideological hatred strengthens Israel's image of Iran as an existential danger. While Iran's nuclear program is mainly meant to stop an invasion and ensure region survival, it has caused major concern in its region. Certainly, Iran's nuclear program, along with indigenously developed long-range delivery weapons, poses a threat to Middle Eastern states and beyond. Furthermore, it weakens Israel's region's nuclear monopoly, giving Iran a higher chance of achieving hegemony.
Next is that Iran's nuclear program is seen as a threat. A nuclear-armed Iran would result in nuclear proliferation in the area. Middle East powers who generally have high threat perceptions are unlikely to look at a nuclear Iran casually. American extended deterrence is no longer reliable in the Middle East, pursuing extending efforts of offset Iranian influence by adopting comparable nuclear posture. Iran's nuclear program has brought about new conflicts between the Biden administration and Israel. The U.S. publicly condemns Iran as a threat to Israel and other countries in the region, particularly in Saudi Arabia. Lastly is the cooperation of Israel and the United States. Israelis and America publicly shared the same opinion of Iran. However, their public positions on how to proceed differ. Israelis have a lower risk tolerance than Americans, who have a lower tolerance for the worldwide ramifications of an attack. Their argument revolves around the status of Iran's nuclear program.
Our analysis in the situation is that over the years, Iran's image around the world has been mostly negative. It is due to the several crises facing Iran: separatism and ethnic and religious tensions, migrations, economic administrative corruption, extreme Shiism, and other critical crises that worsen its economy, image, and reputation. According to the Pew Research Center, They found out that most countries around the world see and think of Iran as a bad and dangerous country, which is why most of them responded unfavorably to their view of Iran, which has the lowest rating in the Middle East. In relation to the topic, Iran's enrichment program seems to be a major threat to many countries, especially the US. Back in the 1950s, when nuclear proliferation is seen as more goal rather than problem, the United States helped Iran create its nuclear program through the United States Atom for Peace program, which aims to help developing countries use nuclear power for energy and other peaceful purposes. The program also helped the United States secure allies during the Cold War. Following the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the relationship between Iran and the United States changed dramatically. Even though Iran no longer received help with its nuclear program from the United States, nuclear development continued. Given the lack of open communication between Iran and much of the Western world, some of the aspects of the Iranian nuclear program's origins and capabilities remain a mystery to this day.
For years, the United States and the international community have worked to keep Iran from developing nuclear weapons, believing that nuclear weapons in the hands of the Iranian regime would directly threaten Israel, destabilize the region, and pose a security risk to the US, Europe, and other allies. A nuclear-armed Iran poses a direct threat to America's Middle Eastern allies. Iran's leaders have repeatedly declared that Israel should be wiped off the map. America's Arab allies such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and others are deeply concerned about Iran's aggressive regional policy and would feel increasingly threatened by a nuclear-armed Iran. Indeed, Iran's military posture has led to increase in arms purchases by its neighbors, and a nuclear-armed Iran would almost certainly spark a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Further destabilizing this volatile and vital region, the US and the international community have a vested interest in keeping the Middle East clean. In conclusion, the introduction of Iran's nuclear agreement, formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, become one of the strategic tools used by the world power to impose restrictions to the country's ongoing nuclear enrichment program, which experts believe is more effective in countering and said countries' actions in developing nuclear weapons.
Based on our analysis, we believe that the BSIS theory that is applicable to this issue is realism. Realism believes that anarchy creates momentum in international relations and that governments face a security challenge since there is no central agency maintaining order in international affairs. As conflict among nations is fundamental in understanding the nature of international politics, state power must be upheld in order to survive and protect themselves. Living in a world where no centralized government exists is a matter of survival among nations. As war was not directly promoted, the security dilemma has been going on, making states heighten their security without letting other nations feel threatened or less secure. Iran, as a country, falls into the category of both defensive and offensive realism. The nuclear technology that the state is trying to achieve has been interpreted in many ways. For Iran, it is for their security as it sees itself as a survivor in a world full of enemies, not particularly but in this topic were Israel and the United States. The state seems to think that the sanction and hindrance of the United States in achieving Iran's nuclear power was seen as a threat. Hence, the states keep on creating alliances that will help them survive. On the other hand, this action of Iran in creating nuclear technology was seen as a threat from Israel's viewpoint. The latter believe that one of the goals of Iran is to completely wipe out Israel from the map.
Israel possesses Iran's hunger for nuclear power as a stepping stone for imperialist hegemony. The United Governments, as the sole regional hegemon in the international system, seeks to prevent the establishment of another regional hegemony by offshore balancing or allying with regional states to prevent the rise of a possible hegemon in the Middle East. Rather than singling out Iran's nuclear program, institutionalism would pursue a policy that enhances the Non-Proliferation Treaty and envisions a Middle East free of nuclear weapons.
In this scenario, Israel hopes for the United States to use its position as a great power to prevent Iran from its action by crippling the Iranian economy and its ability to continue its nuclear program. Israelis have threatened to attack Iranian nuclear sites, but the US has adopted a complicated policy of avoiding outright opposition to such strike while stating that such actions are not acceptable. However, while the US publicly condemns Iran as a threat to Israel and other nations in the area, particularly Saudi Arabia, it describes reservation about military action, fearing that Iran would retaliate by destabilizing the Middle East, and because it does not believe in Iran's nuclear program is advanced as Israel claims. The menace between Iran and Israel that has been going on for decades now can be seen in the lens of realism as both states aim to protect their countries by tightening their security at all costs, may it be in the form of military, economic and diplomatic actions. The United States' presence shows balance of power wherein they do not directly attack Iran but they do sanction and delay its nuclear program while standing on the unclear ground with Israel.
Iran's nuclear goals may simply originated from a desire to maximize its own ability to live and thrive in the system in the future. In terms of power and political concerns, whichever path to stability is chosen, concerned states in the international community should address the issue of Iranian proliferation with the goal of engaging in ways that would eventually settle the domestic imbalance, such as settlement, whether it emerged from the improvement of Iranian political systems or the pacification of Iran's turbulent international relations, might aim to restore a more traditional, realist balance of power in which states would either incorporate as single entities in the international system. That's all for this video. Thank you for listening.